Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law, and we are going to be going through some news stories this week. So I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thanks, Amelia. My name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and a few things to bring you all up to speed on, including a few stories related to things we've talked about previously. So I will pass back to Amelia so we can flick through a few of the stories.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story this week is looking at Apple. So Apple released over the weekend some updates in relation to security. This is because the platform had realized that there was some kind of bits where you could very easily hack into Apple, and this could then render your device somewhat useless. And as you can probably think, with the vast majority of the population having Apple phones and devices, this could be a major problem. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Yeah, it's interesting that a few years ago, Apple users very often were like, oh, well, you can't actually get hacked on our system, it's nice and secure. Well, clearly that isn't now the case after these millions of users have had to update their systems. I think one of the key things here is just a reminder that it is really important to constantly update systems, be it Apple, Android, Microsoft, whatever your operating system is, or indeed whatever versions of certain systems you are relying on. They are vulnerable to being exploited. And if you don't then regularly download the updates that end up plugging some of the gaps, plugging some of the vulnerabilities, you're running a system that could be vulnerable to being exploited. This is exactly what happened and led to the law firm Tucker's being fined by the UK Information Commissioner, was the fact that not only were they not installing updates, this actually conflicted with their own privacy policy, which said, we will install updates to our systems where necessary without delay. So then when the regulator looked at it and said, well, actually, you took 6 months to install this update. That isn't without delay, is it? And therefore, it just sort of shows that when these updates come out, do not delay. Make sure they end up being installed so that you are then reducing the vulnerability of your system. And even if it is your personal mobile device, no one wants to suddenly find that they're locked out from the data on their personal mobile device, be it your contacts, your photographs, your voicemails, your phone. You still want to be able to use the device, and you don't want to lose access to what very often is a huge amount of personal data that we store on these mobile devices. So yeah, install your updates.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I actually, before I'd seen this story, I myself have an iPhone, and I got this notification that you need to update your device. I thought, oh, this is a bit out of the blue, because you do normally hear a lot of press releases and reports before Apple release an update. I was very skeptical. I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting, and then read what the actual fixes were underneath the update, and lo and behold, it was for security reasons, and therefore proving the point that actually you do need to update these devices, and that even though it was my personal phone, I am still installing these updates because it is very important.
Yeah, they're not doing it just for the good of their own health, basically.
Oh no, definitely not. Apple like to increase their power, and this isn't really going to be helping them.
No.
So this was just for us. So moving on to our next story, this is looking at crypto. No doubt you'll have heard from our previous podcast that crypto is in a little bit of a mess at the moment. And this particular story looks at this lad from the US, and he invested around $2,000 and then ended up becoming a millionaire almost overnight. However, with the sudden decline in the crypto industry, he has essentially lost everything. So I will pass over to Peter to unpack this.
So yeah, I think there's several key takeaways here. This was from a large article covered in the Sunday Times magazine a couple of weeks back, which looked at this individual who'd invested $2,000, which almost overnight became $1 million. You know, they're only sort of 16 years old, putting a little bit of their savings into cryptocurrency, and then $2,000 was increased 500-fold very, very quickly. But then earlier this year, the markets have pretty much crashed. Huge losses across multiple different currencies, and there's a few key takeaways, a few lessons, I suppose, from this. One is make sure that if you are investing in a cryptocurrency, that you know that you can take your money out and convert it fairly quickly or easily at a time of your own choosing, should you wish, and that you won't be prevented from doing that, or that there won't be a sort of lock that says, well, you might want to take your money out, but it will take 28 days. There are reasons why you might want to make sure you can get your funds out if you are able to see something like this happening, and can then make sure that you are able to hopefully realize the value of your asset before it is lost. But I think another key point here is to think about what you're actually investing in. And very often, if you are about, certainly in the UK, to move assets from your bank account into a cryptocurrency or onto a trading platform, the main high street banks through their apps will end up sort of asking multiple times, are you sure about this? Is this definitely you? Can we verify your ID? And they'll do that multiple times before they will allow the transaction to go through. And the reason for that is because very often, I mean, there have been about 2.3 million people in the UK who've invested in cryptocurrency, but a lot of them have then lost a huge amount of money. And guess what? They then go back to their bank saying, why did you let me move my money into this cryptocurrency where I've then lost everything? So the banks have got a little bit cheesed off, feeling that they are being held responsible for something that they are not responsible for. So as a result, they're applying mechanisms to make it difficult to move money across. That's not because they're being deliberately difficult. Well, they are being deliberately difficult, but they're being deliberately difficult to try and make sure that their customers hold on to the money that they've got. And let's face it, in the current economy where we are, that's even more important than ever. The second point here as well is to try and do your homework on where you're putting your money. So it's not just a matter of, well, the fella down the pub has made a huge fortune out of it and he told me to put my money into this, so that's what I'm going to do. No, even if you do have a tip from a friend or colleague or family member who says, this currency is really, really good, do your homework. What are people saying about it online? Have there been any investigations against this currency issued by any financial regulators or the police? There was OneCoin, literally called OneCoin, which was a fraud, which was a Ponzi scheme. No blockchain behind it, no technology. If you searched online, you'd find warnings from the Metropolitan Police and other financial regulators around the world, including the FBI, saying, do not invest in this thing, telling you about the fact that different members of the company had been arrested and were facing fraud charges. But people were still investing, while all this was going on, they were still investing in OneCoin. More money continued to go into it. So I think it's really important to just check online, have there been stories about potential fraud, against a particular currency before you put your hard-earned money in there. So it's really important, I think, to do that due diligence in the same way that you'd do if you put your money in any other asset. I think you need to be doing even more of that when it comes to potentially putting your money into a cryptocurrency, and watch out, as I say, in case it turns out it's fraudulent. At the moment, there's very little actual regulation of cryptocurrencies, which in one way makes them attractive, because you'll think, well, it's not encumbered by central banks and politicians and monetary policy and all this boring stuff. It's not encumbered by all that, but the reason is it's not encumbered by that, and therefore it can lose its value virtually overnight. So in this, it talks about one coin going from a value of $80 to one coin down all the way to zero value for one. So it kind of talks about the fact that all of this can happen incredibly suddenly, virtually overnight, and big fortunes can be turned into absolutely nothing at virtually the click of a mouse. So be incredibly careful with what investments you do make, and plenty of due diligence before you put your money in.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story, this is looking at Twitter. Twitter is something we've mentioned in multiple podcasts this year in relation to the takeover from Elon Musk. And so this story is looking at Twitter's former head of security. He has accused the company of being grossly negligent when it comes to protecting the data of its users. So I'll pass over to Peter in relation to looking at why protecting people's data and users' data is very important.
So protecting user data, as you can imagine, is incredibly important when it comes to user privacy. And it's not great when a former head of security who was hired by Jack Dorsey and then fired by the current Twitter CEO, when he says the company has been grossly negligent in how it handles the personal data of its 238 million daily users. I think we need to sit up and take notice. He basically says there has been, and we quote here, a severe lack of security basics. So fundamental levels of security in terms of the system's architecture and infrastructure appear to have been missed when it comes to just making sure that the personal data of users on the system would be protected in line with even the most basic principles of general privacy and data protection. So we aren't talking here, though, about, it's not as though this guy's just tweeted about it. No, there's been an 84-page disclosure as part of the forthcoming the forthcoming case, whereby Elon Musk is now being sued by Twitter for having not proceeded with the takeover. And it looks like, if the court's got evidence from the former head of security saying, yeah, their security principles are naff, and Elon Musk said, this is one of the reasons why I didn't want to spend $40 billion buying it, that becomes quite persuasive evidence.
I'd say.
Things like this might be a reason why Twitter end up settling, rather than having all this washed in full court and displayed in, you can imagine that in particular the courts in the US, far more open reporting of what happens in court than there is in the UK. So this could be really damaging for Twitter. But you can imagine that Elon Musk is probably going to be quite keen for the world to see exactly why he's walked away from this takeover. Who knows, it might even force down the value of Twitter so he can then buy it at half the price.
See, ironically, it's funny you mentioned Elon's take here. Included in this article was an image that Elon had posted in response. And while we can't show it to you, it was fairly interesting and really did highlight his thoughts on this. Essentially, it was, I can't remember from what film, but it was essentially once one whistle blows, so does the rest, or something along the lines of that. And I think it does sum up this story. But I do think, while this has come from the chief security, it does need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because these stories are going to be unearthed in relation to the court case as both sides try and get that edge when we're approaching, I believe it's an October date for the court case.
Moving at comparative light speed.
Yeah.
Litigation like this can take months and years, and certainly can end up being hit by delaying tactics as well. So I think it's incredible that this is moving forward as rapidly as it is.
Precisely. I think it's because of the public interest potentially here. I think a lot of us are interested in the outcome of
public interest and interest from regulators as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So moving on to our next story, a bit of a change of pace here. So we are looking at NATO. So NATO is assessing the impact of data breach of classified military documents that have been taken over by a hacker group that have found these documents and then been selling them online, because, I mean, what else would you do with hacked documents containing classified information? I don't know about you. So I'll pass over to Peter to go through this in more detail.
It is slightly worrying when you think that NATO is currently supplying billions of dollars of arms to Ukraine, when then potentially data, including the blueprints of these weapons, is being hacked by Russian hackers. We understand that one of the advantages that the Ukrainians have had from having this high-end Western technology is, missiles can be launched further, the artillery has a longer range. But if you're going to give away the confidential secrets of that technology by having documents easily hacked containing all of the technical information, that's kind of giving away the family silver for free and giving away your technological advantage. So the point here is that this missile system has been hacked. An external hard drive was compromised. The breach apparently has taken place in Italy. Issues around a supplier, data allegedly stolen, and then apparently that data is now for sale on the dark web. So anyone with 15 bitcoins can go and buy it, which is about £273,000. That value has probably changed since we recorded this. But I think it kind of just shows here the vulnerability. You think you're securely providing arms to Ukraine, yet you could be giving away the secrets of how to defeat those arms through your own cybersecurity and the security of your military contractors being compromised.
It's fairly interesting we're talking about military and the compromise here, because our next story is looking at Strava. So the Royal Navy have Well, this was a story that had been covered a few years ago in relation to Royal Navy personnel using Strava. And if you're unfamiliar with the Strava app, essentially you can get the names and locations of where individuals have been running. And I myself regularly use Strava. I'm fairly competitive, and you can see how other people have been doing on the same routes. So if you think a military personnel out based somewhere, they're on a ship and they're running around this ship, and you can see the exact location at the time of day. I wonder why that could be slightly problematic.
Indeed, particularly when apparently the Royal Navy regularly issues guidance to crews to say, don't share this information. So the idea is, disable the GPS tracking and sharing features, disable the sharing of maps potentially. But I mean, at MI5 and the advice across the British Army has always been, do not share information on apps. And in this instance, it's not just a matter of do not share your location on Twitter or Facebook or TikTok. It's also a matter of thinking about these apps that are giving away your location data. And there's several aspects to this. One is that, of course, you could be giving away the fact that a very sensitive piece of military hardware like a nuclear submarine or ship is docked at a certain point if you're then showing the fact that you're running around Faslane Naval Base, or indeed running around that ship while it is moored somewhere. You're also then say that the ship is moored and you're then going for a run of several miles around the naval base or outside that naval base at a certain time, at a certain day, predictably. You could then be opening yourself up to, if that ship is under surveillance, then people could quite easily pick you up, blackmail you, compromise you, and compromise the integrity of that vessel, all because you are giving away your regular exercise habits online. So there's actually a massive national security implications here, particularly when we think about the fact that we're talking about a naval base where nuclear submarines carrying intercontinental ballistic missiles moor on a regular basis. So it's a worry that advice has been given to crews to say, don't share information using these platforms, yet it's still happening. And indeed, the Times newspaper, which carried this story, actually showed screenshots of maps that have been shared, illustrating the nature of the problem and saying it is an ongoing basis and it's a live issue as of now in August of 2022. So 2 points from this. One, obviously, national security. You want to hope that the Navy stops this sort of information being shared by its personnel. But two, for anyone out there using apps like Strava and other apps, fitness trackers, wearable technology that sort of tracks your personal data in terms of your location and your habits, think very, very carefully, about whether you share that information online. And if you do share it online, look at the privacy settings so that, for example, you're only sharing it with your own trusted contacts rather than just publishing it generally so anyone can see what you're doing, because the risk is that your habits could then be used against you. And you might think, well, this is very, very far-fetched, but it was only a few years ago that a bank manager ended up finding that his family was then held hostage and he was forced to open the vault at his bank. And it turned out that the robbers had just looked on LinkedIn to work out where he lived, where he worked, what his daily commute was, when he did that commute, when he dropped off the kids at school, so they could pick up the family, pick him up and carry out the crime. So this isn't beyond the realms of possibility. Unfortunately, criminals do end up looking at this information to then potentially carry out different acts as a result. So we don't want to be making it easy for them.
Thanks, Peter. And you mentioned kind of privacy and security there. One thing that I do want to flag as a Strava user is not only can you choose who you share your activities with, I think it's also important to mention that you can hide your starting and finishing. Say, for example, you start at home and finish at home. You can change the radius as to where the Strava kind of tracks your location so that you're not finishing and starting in the same place. And while this margin and radius is fairly small, it's only up to a mile, it does give a little bit more privacy in relation to if you are saying, putting this publicly, where you live. I think that's a really important fact to mention. Specifically as well, thinking about kind of female runners, there have been a few stories recently in relation to that, so it's important to flag.
Or indeed, don't end up running the same route predictably at the same time. But that's the real risk here, is that people could work out, oh, you'll be in such and such a park at such and such a time. That is the real risk.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last story for today. Thank you to Anson Evaluate again for producing this webinar, and we will be back next week. So just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, as well as other sites such as Amazon Music and Spotify. And hopefully we will be back next week.